They say it was a beautiful Sunday morning that day in early December 1941 for most Americans. It was a day of rest, a day to be with family, a day to worship the Lord. But what happened in the next few hours forever changed our country in a very real and very profound way. I'm Joe Bickett, and I'm standing in the Garden of Peace at the National Museum of the Pacific War in Fredericksburg, Texas. During the next half hour, we will look at what happened at Pearl Harbor 60 years ago today, how the Japanese attack on our military installations there affected the lives of the people of Texas, why our state was transformed almost overnight into the robust and dynamic place it is today, and the many diverse ways in which the deaths of so many young Americans are remembered and commemorated to this day. This is By Dawn's Early Light, Pearl Harbor in Texas Memory.
There were 5 of us from Fredericksburg, high school students, that were on the same ship together. I loved the Navy in those days. It was good Navy, and we enjoyed it. We ate regular and made a little money, which we didn't have before in the Depression. Money was very scarce. It was a complete surprise when they flew over us and attacked us.
At 7:53 in the morning on December 7th, 1941, Wing Commander Mitsuo Fuchida roared over the United States Naval Base at Pearl Harbor. Below him, the 7 battleships of the U.S. Pacific Fleet lay at anchor in the lazy Sunday morning light. Almost unbelievably, the 183 Japanese attack planes in the first assault wave had achieved total tactical surprise.
The damage control officer on board the West Virginia was able to deliberately flood the starboard side of the ship and counter-flooded so that we kind of sank into the mud without turning over. And so I went back up top side, didn't know what had happened yet. One thing I said, this is the most realistic drill we've had to this point.
I did see the torpedo planes dropping torpedoes and hearing the explosions, and of course when the Arizona blew, it was just unbelievable. It seemed like the whole earth was coming apart.
Helen Brady, pregnant with her second child, was in bed on Ford Island when the attack began.
We had been out the night before playing pinochle with friends of ours in Honolulu, and we didn't really get home until about 2 o'clock. So we weren't planning on getting up early Sunday morning. The little girl usually woke up about 7 o'clock, and she did, but she was playing sort of quietly in her crib, and I could hear her, but I was dozing. And then there was this loud explosion, and of course my husband was up in a flash. He said that was a bomb or a torpedo. So we rushed to the front window and saw a plane pulling out. When it did, we could see the rising sun on it. He said, all right, it's war. He grabbed his clothes and was gone within 3 minutes. But within 45 minutes, the Marines were moving everybody out of Pearl City because the little peninsula was right down into Pearl Harbor, and they took us up the side of the mountain back of Pearl Harbor, and we could see the whole, it was just laid out like a picture before us, with Hickam over to our left and Ford Island almost directly down in front of us. So we had a beautiful view, if you could call it that, of the battleships lined up around Ford Island. And all day long, we watched battleships burning and sinking, watched Hickam Field airplanes burning. Somehow, a young soldier, had gotten in the group that was being evacuated. He wasn't where he was supposed to be, and he had a rifle. And he had that thing in his hands all the time with all these people around him, you know. And he said, they're coming back. I know they're coming back. They're going to land and kill us all. It took a great deal of persuasion to get that young man to just sit down and put that rifle down before he shot somebody. But another lady and I managed it. We just kept talking to him and reassuring him that it was going to be all right, that this was a surprise, but our defenses were good. They were not going to take the island. And of course, they hadn't even thought about it. They might have been able to, for all I know, but we did persuade him, and he settled down.
Back home in Austin, UT College student Louise Vines felt Pearl Harbor's impact in a unique way.
I was to be married at Christmas of '41. My dad heard it on the radio. I didn't hear it, he did, and he came in to tell me, and you know, it was like my world had ended. There was a little song I remember when that somebody wrote, "Don't cry, dear, I'll be back in a year," and that's when they were drafted because you were just supposed to stay a year. So that sounded like a pretty good deal. Didn't work out that way. And it was 4 years before he came back.
During the next 90 minutes, 2 waves of Japanese airmen would assault not only the Navy base at Pearl Harbor, but strafe and bomb the U.S. airfields at Ford Island, Hickam, Wheeler, Kaneohe, and Eva Field. With almost all American fighters destroyed on the ground, the Japanese Zeros, whose job it was to protect the slower dive bombers and torpedo planes, were freed to strafe targets of opportunity at Schofield Barracks, killing and wounding scores of men. Even family quarters were not spared from the Japanese onslaught.
You see, after the planes dropped their torpedoes or bombs, as the case may have been, they were shooting at people or at houses or cars, whatever. They use up all their ammunition before they left. In fact, when we got back home, we discovered that there were bullet holes through our front wall, and the bullets had landed in the sofa back of where it faced the windows, you know. So it's just as well they evacuated me. I might not have made it otherwise.
The American Army Air Corps did manage to get a few pilots into the fight that morning. Most famous of the group, Lieutenants George Welsh and Kenneth Taylor. They traveled by car from Wheeler Field to the small auxiliary field at Haleiwa. The 2 pilots commandeered a pair of P-40 Warhawks and leaped into action. Landing several times throughout the morning to refuel and rearm, these 2 young brave lieutenants gunned down 7 Japanese planes between them. The Japanese sneak attack broke new tactical ground in many ways. Most interesting was the use of 5 2-man midget submarines, whose mission it was to penetrate into Pearl Harbor and pick off any American warships that attempted to flee the harbor. It was a mistake. All 5 subs were lost in action without inflicting any damage on U.S. forces. Helen McDonald explains the fate of the only submarine to survive.
The HA-19, the 2-man midget sub. This one was commanded by Kazuo Sakamaki. When he was here in 1991, we learned so much about it. We learned what happened to him that day, that the fact that the gyro compass didn't work. He kept running aground. They got into Pearl Harbor, got stuck in the net, finally got out. The batteries were letting off noxious fumes. He and the assistant that he had to take turns going up into the conning tower to breathe fresh air. Also, temperatures inside reached 130 degrees. It was extremely hot in there. Finally, they ended up going all the way around Diamond Head Point and essentially running aground on a reef off of Bellows Field. They set the detonator so that it would self-destruct and blow up. Still had the 2 torpedoes in there. That was all supposed to explode, and they swam for it. That didn't work either. Halfway to shore, he realized that it was not going to explode, he turned around and tried to swim back to reset those charges so that it would self-destruct. But at that point he was so tired, he ended up washing ashore and was taken as a captive immediately.
In doing so, Sakamaki became America's first prisoner of war. As the last of the exhausted Japanese pilots returned to their waiting carriers, the massive toll they had inflicted came into bloody focus. 8 battleships, 3 light cruisers, 3 destroyers, and 4 auxiliary craft were either sunk, capsized, or damaged. In addition, the Navy lost 87 fighters, bombers, and observation aircraft, either destroyed outright or heavily damaged. The Army Air Force also took a horrific beating. 4 B-17s, 12 B-18s, 32 P-40s, and 29 other assorted pursuit planes were completely destroyed, with another 128 fighters and bombers damaged. The most painful losses that Sunday morning were the dead, missing, and wounded. 2,403 sailors, soldiers, airmen, and civilians were lost. Of these, nearly half, 1,177 sailors and Marines, lay entombed in the sunken wreck of the USS Arizona. The Japanese losses were slight. Only 29 planes, 1 large submarine, and the 5 midget subs were lost.
The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, of course, is a great tactical success. They catch the Americans by surprise. They devastate the battleships of the Pacific Fleet. They decimate the air power of both the Army and the Navy in Hawaii. It is a crippling blow, but it was a blow that we recovered from, and recovered from very quickly. And one of the reasons, of course, was before the war even started, we had embarked on a great program of rearmament. Whether a year or so after Pearl Harbor, all these new cruisers and battleships and aircraft carriers start coming into service. Well, they weren't built in the year right after Pearl Harbor. Their keels had been laid down several years before the attack on Pearl Harbor. Those battleships, those cruisers, those aircraft carriers, and all those aircraft would have been absolutely worthless in the Pacific if they had not had a viable base to operate from. And a viable base doesn't just mean a place to drop anchor. A viable base means storage facilities, repair facilities, it means barracks, and it means oil storage. The third attack, or the third wave on Pearl Harbor that was not launched by the Japanese, would have targeted the submarine base, would have targeted the oil storage facilities at Pearl Harbor, it would have targeted the warehouses and the armories. In other words, it would have targeted the most vital American assets at Pearl Harbor, the sinews of war, the submarine force, which is going to go on to just absolutely devastate the Japanese merchant marine, could have been crippled by a third strike on Pearl Harbor.
The opportunities for the Japanese, as we look back, had they made that third attack and knocked out the oil storage tanks and the naval shipyard and other ships that were untouched, could have dramatically crushed us even further. Fortunately, the Japanese failed to follow up on that attack and decided against it. And so the infrastructure needed to do the greatest maritime salvage operation in the history of the world was left intact. The lifeblood of the fleet had not been attacked, and it's important to note it wasn't because it was overlooked. There was no way that the Japanese aircraft could then attack these oil storage tanks without obscuring all the rest of the targets. That's why they reserved them.
There was more oil in the storage tanks at Pearl Harbor than there was in the entire National Reserve of the Japanese Empire on December 7th, 1941. If the Japanese had struck those oil tanks and had destroyed them, the American Pacific Fleet, even if it could have been massively reinforced instantly, could not have operated out of Pearl Harbor. It would have had to have been withdrawn back to the west coast of the United States. And of course, if the fleet has to retreat back to the west coast, then the entire nature of the war in the Pacific changes. There would have never been a Battle of Coral Sea that would have saved the supply line between Australia and the United States. There wouldn't have been a Battle of Midway that, basically wrecked the heart of Japanese naval aviation and was really the beginning of the turning of the tide of the Pacific War. It's not to say that the United States and its allies would have given up the war or that they would have lost the war, but it is to say that the war would have been much longer, it would have been much more expensive, it would have been much more costly than what it turned out to be.
The Japanese, in a sense, as one historian from their country noted, their best opportunity to win World War II was lost 2 hours after it started it.
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
Of all the aspects regarding the attack on Pearl Harbor, it's the controversy surrounding FDR's knowledge of Japanese intentions prior to December 7th, the back door to war, that has created the biggest argument between historians, writers, and the survivors themselves.
Now that the Freedom of Information Act has released all this information, we know that it was all just, was part of the plan. The whole thing was planned to get us in the war. And it had to be. I mean, you know, England was just about ready to fall to all the Axis countries organized against her. And she was holding down the fort alone because France had fallen. And
do you have any bitterness then because of?
No, not really. Not after all these years. It's if you let that bitterness, it can eat you up. You know, if you let it get to you.
The draft had passed or been renewed by only one vote in the House of Representatives just a few months earlier. And to let them make the first blow was essential if the country was to be united. That was the judgment that Roosevelt made, in which my uncle would not, he was a Democrat, and he would not go against it, or never criticized it in my presence. I think as I said before, the criticism was more that after the war, after the intelligence situation was no longer important, that they didn't give Admiral Kimmel a fair shake and admit that they hadn't sent him the intelligence they had. I have to agree with Admiral Layton, who says that a higher degree of readiness was warranted. He probably made a poor judgment there. But not to have the intelligence that was residing in Washington was a far greater sin.
I think the revisionist theories that exist today, in particular dealing with the President of the United States, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, is reckless and without merit. And I fully understand why some of the Pearl Harbor survivors embrace that as fact, but there are no facts to support that. If you believe the revisionists, who themselves should be questioned for their own motives of writing books and making documentaries for profit over the bodies of those that lie here, you also have to ask the other question, is what is the other sole purpose? And primarily some of these are based on political dislikes. This has gone on ever since 1942. Over 60 years, the revisionist battle over whether Franklin Roosevelt knew or not is in large part from the protagonists that are trying to promote the ideas that Kimmel and Short were scapegoats. And somewhere in the middle lies the truth. But those who would have you believe, like authors like John Toland and others, Mr. Stinnett, would ask you to accept that the greatest act of treason in the history of our country took place in the complexity of Washington, that FDR orchestrated the Japanese Navy to attack us at Pearl Harbor. That's ridiculous and unfounded. And more importantly, it's reckless. I do not subscribe to that, and no serious historian in this country does either. America loves its conspiracies, and this is one that embraces. From the Lincoln assassination, to the Kennedy assassination, to Pearl Harbor. It seems to be a simple way to explain complex events. I just simply will not buy into that reckless use and adaptation of history.
Back home in Texas, Pearl Harbor changed everything. The National Museum of the Pacific War's curator and historian Jeff Hunt explains the myriad of contributions made by the Lone Star State.
Pearl Harbor naturally affects the entire country. But perhaps no other state in the Union was affected by World War II quite so dramatically as Texas. Texas became one of the most important bases for the training of our armed forces during World War II. By the time World War II was over, there would be 15 major Army bases in Texas. There would be 40 airfields belonging to the U.S. Army Air Forces in Texas. There would be 2 large naval hospitals. There would be a large naval training facility in Galveston. The influx of troops into Texas to be trained was simply enormous. 1.2 million men were trained in Texas during the war. 20 divisions of the Army were trained in Texas during World War II. During World War II, about 500,000 Texans left their rural communities and their farms, and they moved to urban areas to build bases, to work in defense plants, to work in shipyards, and most of those people never went back to the countryside. They never went back to rural Texas. And so there was a vast population shift. The population of Texas increased by 1 million people during World War II. So not only were Texans moving from the farm to the cities to work in war industry and to service the military, but people were coming in from out of the state to do exactly the same thing. And that equated to a 5.8% increase in the population of Texas. And the population of Texas has continued to go up since the Second World War. Texans, of course, fought in the war. Over 750,000 Texans served in the armed forces during World War II. And that includes 12,000 women who joined up and participated in the armed struggle against the Axis powers. Over 23,000 Texans died during the Second World War. 155 generals in the Army and the Army Air Forces were Texans. 12 admirals in the Navy were Texans, including, of course, Fleet Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, the Commander-in-Chief in the Pacific during World War II. Texas, at the time the war started, accounted for 5% of the population of the United States. But Texans in uniform made up 7% of the total number of men and women serving their country during World War II. So Texas, of course, was very enthusiastic about the war. Texans, of course, were as patriotic as everybody else, but they joined up in numbers greater than most other states in the Union. One of the other things that happens in Texas during the war, of course, is that Texas universities train a great many officers for service in the U.S. Armed Forces. Every major college and university had very vigorous ROTC programs, but of course the school where that was going to be most obvious was Texas A&M, where the Corps of Cadets actually provided more officers to the United States military during World War II than any other institution outside of West Point, and some would argue that they actually provided more officers to the armed forces than West Point, because West Point officers tended to be pretty high-ranking, and an Army and a Navy have a lot of junior officers, and a great many of them did come from Texas A&M. In fact, there were a lot of A&M alumni who were on active duty at the time the war broke out. A fair number of them were serving in the Philippines. And so they were among the very first to confront the Japanese, especially to confront them in ground combat. And when the Philippines was lost, a lot of those men wound up going into the captivity of Japanese prison camps. And those who survive that to this day still get together and have reunions and are honored heroes, and justifiably so, by the Corps of Cadets and the alumni of Texas A&M.
The immediate effect of the war on Texas A&M was that it caused a great number of the students to miss graduation because they were drafted or felt impelled to enlist before they finished their course. But they came back, and when they came back, they found that all of the services were sending certain people, certain officers, back to A&M to get special training that they needed in the service. It contributed greatly to the growth of A&M. A&M provided them with a good education at a very low cost, and they could come and learn there and go forth to build up the state. The services profited greatly from A&M's already partially trained officers because of the Cadet Corps and the large numbers of Texas young men who did enroll in ROTC and come out of A&M ready to go to work as a trained officer in one of the services. Aggies are exceptionally proud of themselves, and I think they have good reason to be, because they never quit. They keep going, and it's made the school great, and it made them have a tremendous effect during the war and afterwards. Yeah, give them Aggies.
The Germans declared war on the United States on December 11th, 1941. And as soon as that happened, Hitler orders his U-boats to the shores of the North American continent. And all up and down the east coast of the United States and along the Gulf coast of the United States, German submarines began to sink American merchant ships. The U.S. Navy had few warships to send out to protect all these merchant vessels involved in this coastal trade. And it was ironic, we were putting a great deal of effort into forming convoys to ship war material from America to England to support the British war effort. But it took us a while to institute convoys along our own coast. And so most American merchant ships were sailing independently. Now, those ships were very carefully blacked out so that it would be harder for a German U-boat at nighttime, which was their favorite moment to attack, to spot those ships. But in the first few months of the war, there was no blackout along the American coast. So you would have examples of a carefully blacked out American tanker carrying oil along the coast of Florida. And while the ship was perfectly blacked out, it was also perfectly silhouetted by the glaring, brilliant lights of the city of Miami. And so it was a perfect target for the German U-boats. And that happened not only along the East Coast, it also happened in the Gulf of Mexico. Off the shores of Texas, German U-boats were very active. A great many American ships were sunk. There are famous stories of German U-boats surfacing to periscope depth off of Galveston and off of Corpus Christi. The United States, of course, eventually got around to forming coastal convoys and sending ships out there to hunt down the submarines. But all through 1942 and on into 1943, there was a very active war going on within seeing distance of the Texas coast. And people on the beaches of Galveston could and did look out toward the Gulf and see the rising smoke from American oil tankers that had been torpedoed by German U-boats. And there was every reason for the German U-boats to be off the coast of Texas, because one of the greatest assets that Texas had to give to the United States in World War II, beyond its manpower, was its oil. In 1941, Texas, the state, all by itself, had oil reserves larger than any other nation on the face of the planet. The only country that had more oil than the state of Texas was the United States. And so there are some people who've said that if you want to count as allies the Free French and the British, then you should also count as one of the great powers that fights World War II, the state of Texas, because of the enormity of the resources that it brought to the war effort. Of course, that oil got shipped to the refineries and it got shipped to the fighting front by tankers. Those tankers were juicy targets for the German U-boats until American destroyers and subchasers, a lot of them built right here in Texas, at naval shipyards like Orange, could stymie the U-boat threat and reduce the losses to the German submarines.
In June of 2001, a Texas oil company, while surveying the Gulf seabed, discovered the sunken remains of one of these German U-boats. After 3 long and bloody years, the war with Japan came to an end, and the men and women, soldiers and sailors who had been through so much, celebrated on Congress Avenue in true Texas style. The party, stretching from the shores of Town Lake to the center of the Capitol Rotunda, went far into the night. Legendary Austin radio and television personality Cactus Pryor shares his experience on VJ Day.
And I'll never forget, I went to work for KLBJ, for KTBC radio then, they called it. I was down on the street doing a man-on-the-street broadcast with Dave Smith and Pat Edelman when we got word that the Japanese had surrendered. And it was the damnedest celebration you ever saw. People were throwing, we were right below the Stephen F. Austin Hotel, and people were throwing pillows and mattresses out of the windows upstairs. It was a very dangerous part of the war for some of us. Guys were kissing gals that they didn't know. Gals were kissing guys they didn't know. And the cars were going up and down Congress Avenue, honking their horns. It was just one hell of a celebration.
And they got that fat bomb, they call it. Mm-hmm. And they dropped that over and that changed their mind.
Others reacted to the news of the surrender in a different way.
Mr. Harry Truman solved that problem for me. He dropped that bomb, and that meant, it's all she wrote, Dear John, we are going home. That was our last dance. When he dropped that second bomb, the Admiral come by there, and he says, well, he says, you make up your mind. I said, yes, sir, I sure have. I'm going home. He said, well, I can't talk you out of it. I said, no, sir. Not this time, I says, because I've been gone now going on nearly 5 years, and I says, I'm going home. He says, you say that you had your combat time, but he said, I'll tell you one thing, if Mr. Truman hadn't dropped that bomb and they hadn't given up, he said, you was headed for an LST that was going into Tokyo Bay. Well, I know where that had been. That was a suicide mission. That would have been nothing more than I would not have been here today to talk to you.
When my ship was sunk in May, I went back on survivor's leave, and then I was sent to Great Lakes, where I started. I rented a bedroom for $10 a week. My wife and I were living in this upstairs of a home there on Poplar Street in Waukegan. And Dottie and I were walking from downtown Waukegan, which is about, maybe a half mile. We were walking down the street in Waukegan when they said the war's over and everybody's running out and yelling. And my wife and I just walked down the street just like, just no yelling, screaming, nothing like that. I just, maybe I had a sigh, I don't know, a relief.
The main thing that was hard to get used to was when you'd go topside, some guy would light a cigarette and you'd whack his hand because, we were a darkened ship for 4 years. You didn't have any lights topside at night, and here's the guy lighting a cigarette, Your first inclination is to knock it out of his hand,
There wasn't any popping the champagne or anything because we didn't have any champagne. And we didn't even have any warm beer. But yes, we were happy, but we knew at that time it was all over then.
We drank some sick bay alcohol and with orange juice. We all celebrated. Everybody was just as happy as they could be because we knew we could get to come home again.
The sneak attack on Pearl Harbor continues to ripple through American popular culture in countless ways. Since 1941, no less than 5 Hollywood motion pictures have dealt with the famous air attack, including In Harm's Way, From Here to Eternity, Tora, 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 The Final Countdown, and Pearl Harbor. Armchair admirals reenact the attack endlessly on their tabletops through dozens of board games while digital Zeros and P-40s dogfight above Oahu on computer screens across the nation.
The Strategic Defense Initiative has been labeled Star Wars.
Indeed, even the name Pearl Harbor has taken on a new meaning in the American lexicon. Our national leaders speak of a need for a satellite-based missile defense to avoid a Pearl Harbor in space. And after the horrific events of September 11th, almost every American old enough to remember compared it to December 7th, 1941. Midland, Texas is the national headquarters of the Confederate Air Force. The men and women of the Central Texas branch, based in San Marcos, lovingly care for and restore their priceless collection of aging warbirds and artifacts used by all sides in World War II. Colonel Short explains the origins and mission of the Confederate Air Force.
Confederate Air Force has been in existence since about 1952, and it was done down in South Texas by a bunch of crop dusters who were sitting around and decided they'd go buy an old warbird to fly in their spare time. And they bought Red Nose, or P-51, and we've had it ever since.
Using reproductions and restored aircraft, the CAF presents their reenactment of December 7, entitled Tora, 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 to thousands of spectators across the United States. The Confederate Air Force is dedicated to educating America's young people about the history of the Second World War. CAF historian Billy Parker explains how the Japanese Navy was so successful, and a little lucky, on December 7, 1941.
When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on that December 7th morning, they had quality aircraft, they had excellent weather, they had excellent leadership, they had excellent training. They were, they've been fighting in China since 34 or 5. So they had lots of combat experience. So they were probably the best military in the world with some of the best equipment in the world. The Zero was not very old at that time because it had just gone into service in 1940. But they had real good equipment, excellent conditions, excellent planning, excellent everything. They had developed the Long Lance torpedo, which was capable of running shallow. And as far as the Americans do, Pearl Harbor was a safe harbor because nobody could drop torpedoes in it from aircraft. You simply couldn't run a torpedo in that shallow water. By the time it was dropped from the aircraft and recovered back to shallow depth, it had already calmed down and stuck in the bottom of the bay. So the Japanese torpedo, with a very simple technology, a wooden tailplane to help keep it from diving after it left the aircraft. Plus they practiced with it. They knew how to do it. They altered their techniques a little bit too to help the torpedo, and created a weapon that totally left the Americans with the idea that nobody could torpedo us in Pearl Harbor because they simply don't have any. Our torpedoes dive too deep. Theirs do too. Wrong. They had figured out the problem, and that weapon, along with the dive bombers, pretty much did us in at Pearl Harbor.
The Day of Infamy produced a unique band of brothers, forever bonded through the horrific and heroic events of that Sunday morning. Across the nation, the men and women of the Pearl Harbor Survivors Association meet monthly to remember and commemorate their fallen comrades in arms. Members of the Central Texas branch of the Pearl Harbor Survivors Association meet in the VFW Hall in Georgetown, Texas.
It's one of the best organizations. I belong to the VFW, I belong to the American Legion, I belong to NCOA, and several other organizations, Elks Lodge and all. But there's more camaraderie in Pearl Harbor Survivors than anything else. I try my best, I do everything I can to help them.
And the group's mission?
Keep America alert, to broadcast the news about what we did and what we were subjected to, and to keep America alert so that it will not happen again, and to honor the people that were wounded and perished there at Pearl Harbor. That's our mission. It's just to let the world know what happened and not to let it happen again.
In Central Texas, the scars of Pearl Harbor are all around us. Austin Bergstrom International Airport stands today on the site of the former Del Valley Army Airfield. Constructed on land donated by the city to the U.S. Army in the days following Pearl Harbor, the field's name was quickly changed to Bergstrom to honor Austin's first casualty in the Pacific War, Earl Bergstrom, killed at Clark Field in the Philippines just hours after the sneak attack on Pearl Harbor. When the Air Force Base was closed following Desert Storm, the federal government returned the land to the city.
Japanese evacuated from strategic West Coast areas show little apparent regret. They seem relieved, and some say it's like a holiday.
Adjacent to Zilker Park lies the Oriental Garden, designed and built by Japanese-American Isamu Taniguchi. He and his family were among the 110,000 West Coast Japanese Americans rounded up and sent to a detention camp in Crystal City, Texas. After the war, Mr. Taniguchi was a successful farmer in the Rio Grande Valley and moved to Austin in 1967. With forgiveness in his heart and wishing to pay tribute to the opportunity he had found in America, Mr. Taniguchi persuaded the Austin Parks and Recreation Department to allow him to design and build the gardens in Zilker Park, a remarkable place built by a remarkable man. The Bob Bullock Texas State History Museum in Austin devotes ample space to remembering the role Texas played in World War II. With the threat of German U-boats off the coast endangering vital shipments of Texas crude to eastern military bases, the Big Inch Pipeline, constructed during 1942, delivered over 146 million barrels of Texas oil for the U.S. war effort. Of special interest is the role the Texas aircraft industry and Texas women played in training tens of thousands of American military pilots during the war. Almost overnight, Texas went from having almost no aircraft industry to having one of the largest in the nation. Thousands of the AT-6 Texan trainer aircraft were constructed by women in North Texas and flown to military air bases across the U.S. by the WASPs, Women Air Force Service pilots. These brave Lady Lone Stars freed up thousands of male pilots for military service overseas. Earlier this year, Governor Perry honored Dory Miller.
One of the first heroes of the United States in World War II was also one of the first African-American heroes of the Second World War, and that was Seaman Doris Miller of Waco, Texas, who was on the USS West Virginia, and Miller became a hero by helping to save the captain of the West Virginia, was badly wounded, subsequently died of his wounds, but Miller and others helped to get him to a safe spot on the ship. And then Miller manned one of the anti-aircraft guns whose crew had been knocked out and returned the fire of the Japanese. And as a result of his heroism, Doris Miller became the first African-American sailor in U.S. history to be awarded the Navy Cross.
The Doris Miller Auditorium in Austin is named in his honor. Today, the Japanese still come to the island of Oahu, although now they're tourists, armed with cameras and swimsuits rather than long-lance torpedoes. They come to experience Hawaii's spectacular North Shore, to enjoy the white sand beaches, and to shop for American blue jeans in downtown Waikiki. Many of the bases caught by such surprise on December 7th have returned to their task of defending America's western frontier. Others, like Eva Field, have been dismantled. Where Marines once battled Japanese Zeros armed only with rifles and sandbags, now weekend golfers practice their swings with only a small memorial to mark the site of so much death and destruction. The small satellite field at Haleiwa, where Lieutenants Welch and Taylor took off and shot down 7 Japanese fighters, is now gone. Like a long-forgotten ruin of a lost time, only weed-choked asphalt and a graffiti-covered bomb shelter remain to mark the spot. But it is at Pearl Harbor where the most moving tribute to America's servicemen killed that day is to be found. The USS Arizona Memorial stands guardian over the sunken wreck. National Park Service historian Daniel Martinez explains the memorial's unique place in American collective memory.
The importance of the USS Arizona Memorial is really twofold. It is now a national memorial, one of probably the most famous in American history dealing with World War II. The memorial is a pilgrimage site for so many veterans that come here. So it serves as the national memory, but it also serves as a touchstone for those that remember World War II and lived it. For the USS Arizona survivors, it is a place where many of their crewmen still stand at their station. It is a place where some of them request that their ashes be brought and interned into the vessel. For them, it's still a home.
The vast majority of U.S. Army Air Corps pilots never got airborne. Hardest hit, Hickam Army Airfield. Pacific Air Force Command historian Dr. Timothy Keck details why most of the men never knew what hit them.
The attack on Oahu, on the naval installations, Army Air Force's installations, was a very effective air attack. Part of the reason from the air standpoint that it was that we had parked both fighters and bombers wingtip to wingtip rather than dispersing them because of fear of subversion and espionage, that the Japanese population of the island would prove loyal to the emperor and sabotage any American activities. That little tinge of racism proved fatal to us. Well, the headquarters building at that time was the largest Army Air Forces barracks. It held some 3,600 personnel. It was a prime target and was both bombed and strafed. And the first wave, a bomb went down in the center of the building and killed 65 people instantaneously. It went into the mess hall area. You can see from photographs that the building was severely damaged, but it was a very sturdy structure, and the building itself held. It was absolute chaos for the men stationed here in the barracks that morning. They were all summoned to draw weapons and fight back as they could. And by the second wave, we had machine gun emplacements on the roofs of hangars and this building, and people were doing what they could, which at that time wasn't much. A young man, and we don't know who he is, he's lost to history, climbed into the nose turret in a B-18 that was sitting out on the flight line at Hickam, and set up a machine gun and was firing at the incoming strafing Japanese fighters. The plane caught fire, and he was unable to escape. But he simply sat at his gun and fired and fired and fired until the entire aircraft was consumed. And a young doctor was on the flight line, had come in with one of the B-17s and was wounded trying to tend to people on the flight line. He was taken to the clinic, which had just opened here, a 40-bed clinic. His name was Lieutenant William Schick. After what he had done, he also refused treatment. He insisted that the quite overwhelmed medical personnel at the clinic take care of others first, and he died that day on the way up to Tripler Hospital. The clinic is named after him.
In tribute to the fallen, the U.S. Air Force later converted the Hickam Mess Hall into the Courtyard of Heroes. The quiet and beautiful garden still retains the Japanese bullet holes along the interior walls. In the mid-90s, the USS Missouri was finally decommissioned by the Navy and was brought to Pearl Harbor to act as a floating museum. The ship, on which the Japanese signed the Instrument of Total Surrender, now lays at anchor just across from the Arizona Memorial. It is fitting that the ship where the war ended now sits side by side from the ship where the war began. Many of the dead never left the island of Oahu. Sitting just above the city of Honolulu is the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific. Carved out of an extinct volcano, the Punch Bowl, as it's called, contains the graves of thousands of U.S. servicemen who died in action. It remains today a lushly beautiful resting place for many of the men who would never see Texas again. The state of Texas has produced many public works related to the Japanese sneak attack. The battleship Texas, retired from active service in 1946, is now a floating state historical park in La Porte, Texas, just across from the San Jacinto battlefield. The USS Texas, a sister ship to the martyred USS Arizona, saw action throughout World War II, including the invasions of Normandy and Iwo Jima. There's the Pearl Harbor Highway, running between Johnson City and Fredericksburg, and even the special Pearl Harbor Survivor license plates, minted by the State Department of Highways, granting lifetime free parking in any public metered parking space anywhere and anytime within state boundaries. But the shining jewel of the state's World War II attractions is the National Museum of the Pacific War in Fredericksburg, Texas. Helen McDonald explains the unique role the museum complex plays in American history.
People are so surprised. When they come to see it, if they haven't heard about it in advance or haven't seen some element of material related to it, they're literally blown away. We have a fabulous collection. I mean, just related to Pearl Harbor alone, the dress sword of Admiral Husband Kimmel, who was Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific, the hatch cover from the Arizona with the torched hole where they looked for bodies and survivors, a tunic that belonged to Admiral Yamamoto. Yamamoto was the one in charge of the attack on Pearl Harbor. Also from the Japanese, we have the scarf that was worn by Zenjei Abe, who led a wave of Val dive bombers off the Akagi on December 7th. That was the formation that Ken Taylor got up and shot down several Vals with his P-40, along with George Welch. We've got a fabulous collection. To say nothing of the HA-19, the premier object from Pearl Harbor. It is a top-quality, first-rate museum.
The museum has become so well respected internationally that the leading Japanese Zero ace to survive the war, Saburo Sakaya, donated his flight helmet, scarf, and other personal effects to the Texas-based museum following his death in 2001. Mr. Sakaya's gesture to the people who were once his enemy speaks volumes for the respect the museum has gained around the world. Jeff Hunt also educates thousands of visitors through the museum's Living History program. Using uniforms and original weapons from the Pacific conflict, Jeff and his fellow reenactors teach history in a way not found in books or display cases.
Well, this is our Island Assault 1944 program, and we do 6 weekends out of the year. And basically, the museum's Living History detachment of about 30 volunteers is out here wearing authentic World War II uniforms and equipment and demonstrating the most important infantry weapons of the Pacific War. For the last 3 or 4 years, we've had about 14,000 students a year come through some version of the Education Living History program at the museum. Since its inception about 6 years ago, that means we've had nearly 65,000 students come here to the museum. And then, of course, it's really wonderful because we have a lot of veterans come through here and they see this program, and when somebody who was there comes up and tells you that they love what you're doing, that what you're doing is important, and they want you to keep going, there's no better feeling in the world than that.
Remember the unfortunate Ensign Sakamaki and his malfunctioning midget submarine? Helen McDonald explains the strange and profitable odyssey that submarine took following December 7th.
It immediately came into the possession of the Navy, and the Navy stripped it down. They learned so much. You know, the Japanese torpedoes were far superior to anything we had. So we did learn additional knowledge in that, and we didn't have anything that went as fast as that midget sub. It was truly a remarkable piece, even though this particular one obviously had flaws in it. It then was taken apart in sections and shipped to the United States and went on war bond drives. It went across the United States from every major city, every little town, and people could purchase a 25-cent coupon or bond to go up and look inside. With those 25-cent coupons going in every city, every little town across the country, they were able to raise enough money to pay for the physical damages that were done at Pearl Harbor. It was commanded by Kazuo Sakamaki, and when he was here in 1991, we really gained a greater depth of knowledge in that of what happened to him during that time, what his experiences were, what his recollections were. And he was reunited with Steve Weiner, and Steve at that time had been a lieutenant in the Army, and he was the first one to interrogate him. And so those two men came together and they visited, and he said, "Do you remember the hard-boiled egg?" "Yes." And he said, "You were so cold, I put a blanket around you and gave you a shot. We found some bourbon whiskey. Do you remember that?" Yes, he remembered that. So I mean, it's really cool.
December 7, 2001. From across the nation, over 300 survivors from 40 states have gathered for the national commemoration of the Day of Infamy. The festivities began yesterday as the newly remodeled Pacific Combat Zone was reopened to the public.
This is a 3.5-acre site that we have spent $1 million to develop. And the purpose of this site is to give the visitor to the hometown of Fleet Admiral Nimitz a chance to step into the Pacific Theater during World War II. So we're actually trying to take people not only back in time, but geographically into the Pacific. So we begin by allowing people to walk onto the hangar deck of an American aircraft carrier serving in the Pacific, where they'll actually see a TBM Avenger torpedo bomber of the type that former President George H.W. Bush flew. Then they'll walk out of that building and they'll pass an American anti-aircraft gun position and walk into another building where they find themselves at a PT boat base that would be, say, in the Solomon Islands in 1943. And there they'll sit along the dockside and look at PT-309, an actual combat veteran PT boat. And when they leave the PT boat base, they'll walk onto an island beachhead that's just been stormed by American GIs and Marines, and they'll get a chance to look at some of the key weapons and vehicles that allowed us to storm ashore on these Japanese islands. And then they'll walk around a little trail and they'll find themselves standing amid the Japanese defenses, pillboxes, artillery pieces, tanks, staring down at the beach so that they can see the defensive advantages the Japanese had as the American infantry and armor and artillerymen rushed the beach. And once you've learned a little bit about how these Japanese positions were taken by American troops, you learn about the cost of the war. We've recreated a temporary cemetery where American forces would have been buried immediately after a battle. And from there you walk into a Quonset hut that has been turned into an advanced base hospital of the type that you would have found, say, on Okinawa, that was built preparing for the invasion of Japan in the fall of 1945.
Actor and Pacific War veteran Cliff Robertson reflects on the meaning of Pearl Harbor.
I think it has double significance. We have men and women in harm's way over at Afghanistan as we speak. We've lost some already. We certainly lost a lot in the World Trade Center, innocent victims, and we lost a lot of service people in Pearl Harbor. So I think this is a salute, if you will, to all three of those events. The terrible, terrible Pearl Harbor catastrophe, the World Trade Center catastrophe, and the harm that our boys and girls are in over in Afghanistan. So it's a way of reminding them that we don't forget. And I think that's important to remember, that this country has had a lot of tribulations and trials and problems and tragedies, but somehow or other, with good help of the good Lord, we seem to survive.
This is wonderful. This is a Texas-sized barbecue, and it's typical of what Admiral Nimitz gave during World War II. And we have over 400 World War II Pacific Pearl Harbor survivors with their family members. 1,200 family members are here joining them, and it's a barbecue with the Sentimental Journey Band. We are recreating the December 6, 1941 Battle of the Bands for these people here tonight.
Well, this is December 7, 2001.
It seems fitting to be gathered here, not so far from San Antonio on the Alamo. As you remember the Alamo was the rallying cry that helped lead to the creation of the Texas Republic. And just as we still remember the Alamo today, with the help of the Nimitz Museum, we still remember Pearl Harbor, and we always will.
So now our story comes to an end, and as we have seen through the good works of the eyewitnesses, the preservationists, the educators, and living historians, the Confederate Air Force, and the men and women of the Pearl Harbor Survivors Association, Texas will always say, now and forever, Arizona, we remember you.
All my buddies on the Arizona, they say I'm a fool to go, but just the same this Christmas I'll change your name, and I'll say I told you so. When the trade winds come blowing home, I'll be coming home back to Waikiki. I'll hold my knees, say on Saturday our love has just begun beneath the rising sun.
I do know that people who were there will shortly all be gone. There's that. But then you will always have, like, remember the Alamo. It's going to be remember Pearl Harbor.